In this episode, we are going to talk all things peonies, particularly how to dig, lift, divide, and replant them so that you have beautiful, bounteous blooms next spring. And did you know this also will apply to all perennials, because it's important to dig and divide your perennials about every decade or so. At the minimum. If you don't do that, you end up with things like bald patches in the centers of your plants, rot issues, and in my case, I had trees suckering all throughout these peonies because I inherited them and they were here decades before I was here, and it made this job extra difficult, as you will see. So if you want to learn some tips, some tricks on perennial division and replanting in the fall, watch on. All right, let's dig in. Behind me, you can see some very brown, crispy plants with some volunteer hackberries growing out of them. Yes, those are my peonies, and it's actually quite common for them to look that sad this time of year in September in the Midwest. Largely because peonies really are their most glorious and beautiful for 2 weeks out of the year, maybe 3 if you're lucky and you don't get your peonies flowers stripped by rain, hail, or wind like we tend to have happen in Kansas. They tend to look pretty pitiful, and that's quite normal. The reason we put up with it as gardeners because it is worth it for their heavenly scent and beautiful blooms in that short period of time. They're just really, really quite lovely. The first thing I do when I'm digging perennials is I identify where the crown of the plant is. That's basically the point at which all the stems, the main growth, are coming out of. So I kind of start by identifying where those peony stems are, and then I make a circle with my shovel about 6 to 12 inches outside of that range, and then I dig underneath the tubers. And that's kind of a hit and miss process, but I try to dig about a foot underneath. Depending on the age of how long your peonies or your perennials have been there, will depend on how deep the roots have sunk in there. But usually peonies don't really do well if they are deeper than a couple of inches even from the surface of the soil. So we shall see how this goes. It's not really practical to think that I could pull out a peony that's been living there for decades. It's 3 foot across at least. I'm not going to be able to pull that out in one big piece. So I am pulling it out chunk by chunk. I'm kind of dividing it into sections. But as I was doing so, I found a surprise. Some daffodil bulbs were hanging out there. I did not know these were there. They're covered up by those peonies, and I'm kind of excited. I did accidentally slice into a couple of them because I didn't know they were there, but I have plenty of little daughter bulbs to go ahead and plant this fall when I'm replanting these peonies. So I have a nice large chunk here. The thing that made this particular job for me difficult was all of the suckering trees that were intermingled with my peonies, and that's part of the reason I'm lifting them, because these are becoming a serious issue. And as you'll notice, they just keep getting clipped back and clipped back and clipped back, and I just couldn't stop them from continuing to grow, and they made it really hard to pull this peony out in one large chunk. So I pulled out the largest chunk I could to show you, but what ended up happening, because gardening is never perfect, it never goes exactly how you plan it to go, that's part of the fun. What ended up happening is I kind of divided these as I went. So I have lots of chunks here that are already at the size I need them to be. But if you were pulling this out and you didn't have this to untangle it from, the next step would be to shake off this loose soil here and kind of clean these up so that you can see what's cooking here. So I'm going to go ahead and clip off these stems because they are doing no good for this peony. That way we can get a little bit more of a clear idea of what's going on here. All right, so peonies are geophytes, which means that they have parts of their plant that store water and nutrients underground. This particular type of geophyte is a tuber. And a common tuber that most of us think of is a potato. And if you've ever peeled potatoes, you know they have those pesky little divots in those dimples. Those are the eyes of a potato. And actually a potato or a tuber, just like a peony, is an underground stem. And the reason it's a stem and not a root is because roots don't have nodes and stems do. And tubers, those little dimples, are actually nodes where new growth can occur, new stems can shoot off. And on peonies, just like with potatoes, those little nodes are called eyes. And whenever you are dividing a tuber, you want to make sure that it's got at least 3 to 5 eyes on it, or buds, so that when you plant it, it can flower within that coming year. Now, some of my divisions that came out because of how gruesome that was to dig it up with all those volunteer tree roots, some of them have only 1 or 2 eyes on them, and they're gonna take a few years to produce flowers. But it doesn't mean they're dead, it just means I've taken them down to their bare minimum. So I'm probably gonna throw those into nursery pots and grow those up, grow those on, and get them to flower in a couple years. It is really hard to know kind of where to divide your peony. Honestly, I was thinking about leaving this chunk whole since it's my biggest peony, and I have plenty of small divisions, and I didn't have a ton of roots come with my eyes, because you really want to have 3 to 5 eyes plus some pretty healthy roots. Now it's got some good tubers going there, but that's part of the reason you want to do this job 30 days at least before your first average frost, because it gives this plant plenty of time to get its roots established before we hit cold weather and the ground starts to freeze. We need to make sure that we get those roots tapping so it survives the winter. So next up is just to divide. You'll want to get a tool that has a sharp edge. I have a bulb setter here that is very sharpened, but a hori works really well as well. It's just a Japanese gardening knife. I have one, I just don't know where it is, but this will work just fine. I've counted, and I have at least 10 eyes on this that I can see on this particular peony. What's weird is it's got this really old part that's kind of concaved out, like almost like water sat in it and it rotted that way. Did I mention that peony was sitting there for decades without being lifted? It's really wise to lift your perennials at least every 10 years just to keep them from getting bald spots in the center and having rot issues, decay issues. And it also makes the job easier if you do it more regular than not, because the bigger it is, the harder the job. All right, so we're just gonna slice and dice. All right, so after dividing, I have 2 really nice divisions here. They're nice medium divisions. They have at least 5 eyes on each one of these. They've got some nice tubers on them. What's left to do now is to plant them in their new site, go ahead and give them a home. But also I've got to divide the rest of this monstrous peony and get it cleaned up and ready to go, and also fill this hole back in and put stump killer on all those terrible suckering trees. So that's to do next. So after getting these all cleaned up and divided, I have counted 19 divisions from one plant. And not to mention, I had 3 that had 1 or 2 eyes on the divisions, separate from the 19. So 19 solid divisions from one plant. And I have 4 more to go, so I'm exhausted just thinking about it. The sun is setting, so I wanted to go over with you really quick what the next 2 paths are that you can take with your divisions. One, the obvious one, you can replant them for spring blooming next fall. Now, I don't have room for 19 peonies plus whatever the 4 remaining give me, but what I will say is that if you are going to go with the planting route, just make sure you choose a nice sunny site that's not low in your yard so you can avoid rotting and powdery mildew and all that jazz. Plant your peonies about 2 inches, so their eyes are 2 inches deep, so that you don't plant them so deep that the peonies rot or don't have sun enough to push them up and cause them to flower. Then in November, after those plants have gotten their roots tapped in our warm season, before it gets really cold, you'll want to mulch with 2 inches of mulch over them so that these plants don't heave. Because Kansas has shrink, swell, clay soils, those tend to shrink and swell with our temperature change and our moisture change. It can actually heave new planted bulbs out of the ground. So mulching helps to prevent that temperature change that can cause that heating. So make sure you don't forget to set your reminder on your phone to mulch your peonies or any of your fall bulbs in November before we get really seriously cold. I'm gonna do that with my little daffodil bulbs that I discovered in this video as well. So that is your what you're gonna do if you move forward with planting in ground. Now, if you have too many divisions, or if you want to give some to friends, and in my case, I'm going to sell some of these on the bus, you can get some gallon-sized nursery pots and some loose-fill bark mix and plant these in those containers, water them in just as if you were watering them in the ground, and overwinter them that way. You could do it in a protected garage or somewhere dark and cool over the winter. Make sure they have that cool temperature. I will grow them in my greenhouse where it gets down to about 30 degrees, give or take, in there over the winter, but that's a great place for me to overwinter my peonies. So there's your two methods. You can either plant in ground right away, some of them, and that's what I'm gonna do with some of mine, and then also you can overwinter them in containers and give them away to friends and family. So those are your two planting methods. Now, one thing I wanted to say before we wrap up this episode. Remember, no gardener is perfect. This is a messy and nitty-gritty job. You're gonna feel like you're doing it wrong the whole way, but just barrel forward with confidence. Make sure you kind of pay attention to the tips that I gave you, and hopefully you enjoy dividing your perennials, specifically your peonies. So that's all I have for you in this episode of Unearth Horticulture. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, it's been grand.